Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Don Preston. William Bell will not be able to be with us this evening. He's got another appointment. He's, along with another brother, he's going to be attending a service, a gospel meeting this evening at a local congregation there in Memphis, try to drum up some support and interest in the upcoming seminar that's to be held there in Memphis in October, October 18th to the 20th, I believe is the dates on that. I am very, very much looking forward to being there. I'm only one of several speakers that will be speaking at this conference. The theme is the eschatology in Pauline epistles. And I tell you what, you got Steve Basin, you got Holger Neubauer, you got Daniel Rogers, you got Roy Runyon, you got John Holt, of course you got William, and you've got me. Hope I'm not missing anyone, but it's absolutely great lineup. Lots of great topics, subject matter. And I've got to tell you, folks, I am personally really torn on how to exactly what I want to speak on. My text, either way, is going to be Colossians 2, 14 to 16, where Paul told the Colossians, do not let any man judge you, therefore, in respect of new moons, feast days, or the Sabbaths, which are a shadow of the things that are about, good things that are about to come, but the body is of Christ. And I'm torn on how to approach this. Either way, my topic is going to be, when did the law of Moses pass away? And the traditional view in the amillennial world is that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross, as Paul supposedly says in that very text, where he says that the handwriting of ordinances, which was against us and contrary to us, was taken out of the way, being nailed to the cross. And we're told that that refers to the law of Moses itself. Well, I'm going to be examining that claim, showing that it's false. But here's the deal. Here's my dilemma. It can be shown very powerfully, very effectively, very definitively that Paul was not saying that the law itself had been nailed to the cross, because the law and the cultic practices, the feast days, the new moons, the Sabbaths, were all remained when Paul wrote as shadows of the good things about to come. And when we examine the significance of those new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, that means that all of Israel's festal calendar, her feast days, which foreshadowed the eschatological consummation, had not been fulfilled. And yet Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle of the law shall pass until it's all fulfilled. Well, let me tell you, Israel's feast days were a fundamental part of the law. So when Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle of the law shall pass until it's all fulfilled, that means that all of the feast days had to be fulfilled. All the types and the shadows contained in the festival observances had to be fulfilled before the law could pass. Well, since they were still, at that time, valid figures, types, and shadows of what had not yet come, that means the law had not passed. So that lesson would focus on the meaning, significance, and the typology of Israel's feast days and when they were supposed to be fulfilled. But then I'm torn about the fact that when Paul is talking about the passing of the covenant, passing of the old law, there was nothing in Israel's mindset, nothing in Israel's worldview that spoke more powerfully of covenant than the marriage. And I want to tell you something. I am firmly of the view that any position, any interpretation of Colossians 2, 14 to 17, that ignores the relationship between Torah, the law of Moses, the old law, the covenant, and God's marriage, divorce, and remarriage of Israel, that completely divorces any discussion of the end of the law from that context, virtually is guaranteed to be wrong. Like I said, do I focus on the types and the shadows of the feast days, that the types and the shadows of the feast days would not be removed until the feast days were be fulfilled? Or do I focus on God's marriage, divorce, remarriage of Israel, and the passing of the old covenant? That's my dilemma. And I'm torn between the two. I don't know which one I will choose. Well, anyway, I think you can see there's a wealth of information there, though. Fascinating study, either one of those. And I'll make up my mind. I'll present the one, and then hopefully I'll be able to present the rest of the material at another seminar on another occasion. In the meantime, thanks again for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. We began about 4 weeks ago a discussion of the Messianic Temple. And we are living in a time, and look, this has been going on for generation after generation, in which we have been assured that the rebuilding of a temple in Jerusalem is just right around the corner. Listen, I've shared with you that in the 70s, all right, as a matter of fact, going back into the mid and the late 60s, when I was a junior and senior in high school, I remember very, very well reading newspaper articles. And I certainly didn't have the interweb, as they call it, back then. But I remember reading newspaper articles. I remember reading journal articles. I remember hearing radio discussions claiming that there were box cars full of building material that was getting ready to be shipped to Israel because the time is right for the rebuilding of the temple. I remember hearing the excitement, the enthusiasm, and in some circles almost the fear that the end was so horribly, terribly, truly imminent. Now remember, this is in the mid to late 60s, over 50 years ago. And yet the temple has not been rebuilt. And as I've shared with you over the last few weeks, in 2004, 2011, 2012, 2014, and now just a few weeks ago, we have been assured, we have been absolutely assured that a pure, ceremonially pure red heifer has been born in Israel. And that proves that we're in the end times. That proves that the rebuilding of the temple right around the corner. Let me remind you, back there, all of those previous times when the red heifer had supposedly been born, and yet, what happened? each of those supposedly ritualistically pure red heifers turned out to have either some white or gray or black hairs that appeared on them, and all of a sudden they were ceremonially unclean. They could not serve. Well, folks, let me encourage you to go to my website, donkpreston.com, and go to the blog and do a search. On the right-hand side, you'll just scroll down, and you can do a search for articles. And just type in red heifer. You will find there 6 or 7 articles that I have written over the last few years addressing these claims that the red heifer had been born, the time is at hand, it's time to rebuild the temple. And the problem of it is, those who make the claim absolutely, completely are ignoring, or they are ignorant of the fact that the entire cultus of Israel, as Paul says in Colossians 2, the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths. And then in Hebrews chapter 9, 11 to 13, where Paul talks about the ashes of the heifer, sprinkling the unclean, purified to the flesh, but not the spirit, not the conscience. Okay? All of those things were typological. And they pointed to Jesus Christ. He's the body. He's the reality. He's not the shadow of something else that's still to come. He's not anticipating something else to come. Jesus, whose blood is absolutely perfect in taking away our sin, is the fulfillment of the red heifer sacrifice. What does that mean? It means that there's no need for a red heifer, a literal red heifer, because Jesus is the purification. He is the sanctification. He is the anointing, if you please. And he is the foundation stone of the Messianic Temple. And so all of this excitement that continues to crop up just every little bit, that we are supposedly in the time of the end, we are supposedly just about to see the rebuilding of the Messianic Temple. It is all absolutely false. Now, I want to remind my audience here. I want to remind the listeners of Fulfilled Radio that urge you repeatedly now to go to Dr. Michael Brown's YouTube page and urge Dr. Brown to debate me for the 3rd time. I've already had 2 debates with him. They didn't turn out too well for him. I have tried repeatedly to get him to debate me again. He seems totally unresponsive. But if enough people went to his YouTube page and urged him to debate me on the Messianic Temple, will there be in our future a rebuilt, literal, physical temple in Jerusalem? Whether he wants to talk about a temple built by Antichrist, or whether he wants to talk about a temple rebuilt by Jesus, the true Messianic Temple. Doesn't matter to me. I'll debate either one. But please go to Dr. Brown's YouTube page and post a comment urging him to have a 3rd formal, moderated YouTube debate with me, a 2-hour moderated debate on the Messianic and the Millennial Temple. This is an important issue. I want to share with you something. Just today, I'm coming to the end of my series on YouTube and Facebook of the study of 1 Corinthians 15 and the resurrection. And I've made comment asking people that if they have a subject that they would like for me to discuss, please send me their suggestions. I have had appeals today And I would call them urgent appeals from people who tell me they're deeply troubled by all of the claims of the one world government. By the way, I don't know if you heard it today or not, but Donald Trump, in his UN presentation, said we in America are opposed to one world government. We believe in U.S. independence. We believe in U.S. nationalism. We believe in U.S. sovereignty. Well, hello. I tell you, that really ought to be a wake-up call to all of this stuff that's on the internet about the one world government that's coming. When the president of the United States gets up and says, we reject the idea of one world government. We believe in American sovereignty. We believe in American independence. Well, number one, that ought to tell us Donald Trump is not the Antichrist. Donald Trump is not looking to establish the one world government. Now, I suppose somebody's going to jump up and say, but he's lying. He is lying. But anyway, the point being that these individuals who have contacted me have said, Don, please do some YouTubes on the one world government. The inserted chip into human beings, the one cashless government, one cashless world economy, Trump being the Antichrist, and on and on and on. And this person, one person particularly, and there were others, was deeply frightened with all of this stuff that is out there. And by the way, they particularly ask about, what about the claims of the red-heifer? Folks, that's why we do this program. Because we understand that an awful lot of people are out there who are listening to these radio, television, YouTube preachers, so-called prophecy experts, who do nothing but fan the flames of fear, who do absolutely nothing but pervert the scriptures, who do not even begin to understand what biblical exegesis is all about. I mean, in their books, if the Bible said a temple will be rebuilt, it doesn't matter when that was written. It must apply to today. That's an abuse of hermeneutic. That's an abuse of audience relevance. That's a hermeneutic of anachronism. Folks, we have to take the biblical text in its context. And so, it's so important that we address these issues right here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio. We want you to be able to trust what you hear on this program, because we are going to share with you directly from Scripture what the Bible says. We're going to show you the context. We're going to show you the time frame. We're going to show you the framework. And we're going to honor those contextual factors so that the intro to this program says, we're going to bring you peace of mind. We're going to bring you comfort and assurance. We're going to show you that there is no need to fear the future. So, with that said, after I finish the series on the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, I'm going to take 4 or 5 videos perhaps, and I'm going to address those concerns that these individuals have written to me about today, saying, please, 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 talk about the red-heifer. Please, talk about the one world government. Please address Donald Trump being the Antichrist, and on and on. And we're going to be able to show you from Scripture why there is no need, there's not even a solid basis for believing these claims that we are in the last days. Now notice this. We began this series by an examination of Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and following. Now, Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 are one united prophecy. I really don't know of anybody that denies that. All you have to do is, as you read Isaiah 2 through 4, start paying attention to at that time or in that day. Now, in that day refers you to the antecedent discussion. And it links Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 together as one united, harmonious prophecy. And it is a prophecy of the last days. Now, what that means is, and this is so critical as we discussed in one of our early programs in this discussion, if you and I are in the last days, then the temple of God must be built during the Christian age. In other words, if you identify the temple of God, or if you predict the temple of God to be built, then it has to be built in the last days. So if you identify the last days as the Christian age, then the Messianic Temple has to be constructed during the Christian age. Well, all millennialists and postmillennialists tell us, well, yeah, the last days, they really are the Christian age, although there are many postmillennialists who admit and who teach very well, I might add, that the last days is a reference to the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Well, that's the truth, ladies and gentlemen. The last days is not a reference to the Christian age. It's the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Now, by the way, I wrote a book entitled The Last Days Identified. I examine every single major, there are a couple of incidental passages that refer to the last days that do not give us any detail whatsoever. They do not give us any evidence to build a case on. They're just simply almost passing references. But in every major reference to the last days, I go to those texts, I go to those contexts, and I show that they are not and they cannot be speaking about the Christian age. They were talking about the last days of Old Covenant Israel. They were talking about the last generation of Old Covenant Israel. So what does that mean? It means that the Messianic Temple was to be rebuilt in Israel's last generation. Now, our dispensational friends try to escape the force of that. And they say, well, that's essentially true, but the last generation, if you want to use that term, of Israel is, guess what? The 70th week of Daniel, chapter 9. And so they break that up into the period from the rapture to the middle of the 7th week, 3.5 years. And in the middle of the week, the man of sin breaks his treaty with Israel, begins to persecute Israel, destroys that temple, begins to destroy Israel. And at the height of the persecution, at the height of the Great Tribulation, Jesus comes. Well, see, folks, that's supposedly Israel's last days. I mean, how do you get Israel's days beyond the 70th week of Daniel? The 70th week of Daniel is the pivotal, climactic period of time for Israel. It's the time for the cessation of the prophetic office. And the fulfillment of all prophecy. It's the time to bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, that's the Messianic kingdom. That's the eternal new heaven and the new earth. And on it goes. You honestly cannot get Israel's last days beyond the 70th week. And yet, on the one hand, dispensationalists say, yeah, Israel's last days are the 70th week. But then they claim, guess what? They claim that Israel's Messianic kingdom begins after the end of the 7-year tribulation. In other words, Israel's last days are not the 70th week. Israel's last days is really 1,000 years long. See, it makes no sense whatsoever. Now, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house would be established in the tops of the mountains. That's the Messianic Kingdom Temple. It would be established in the last days. Okay, now watch. The Messianic Temple would be established in the last days. Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2, God who at sundry times and in divers manners has spoken to us by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. Okay, that means that the writer of Hebrews was in fact living in the very time foretold for the rebuilding of the Messianic Temple. He was not anticipating a different last days period. He was living in the last days. Now, this is driven home even more effectively when we look at the entire scope of the book of the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews does not look forward to another period of fulfillment. The book of Hebrews, the keynote word for the book of Hebrews is better. Jesus is better than Moses. What an incredibly stunning and challenging thought. Jesus is better and greater than Abraham. Wow, how incredible. Jesus is better than the Levitical priesthood because he is the priest after the order of Melchizedek. And by the way, Abraham and thus Aaron and the Levites, by representation, see, the ancient Hebrews believed in representative actions. And what I mean by that is, when Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, that was the same as Aaron, who hadn't even been born yet, paying tithes to Melchizedek and submitting to the greater Melchizedekan priesthood. But Aaron hadn't been born, and by the way, Levi had not yet been born to Aaron. There was no such thing as the Levitical priesthood, and yet the writer's point in Hebrews chapter 5 through 7 is that when Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, that meant that Abraham recognized that Melchizedek priesthood was greater than his, even though he hadn't been born. And it proved, therefore, that the Levitical priesthood acknowledged the greater Melchizedekan priesthood. This is representative action. Abraham's singular action meant that Abraham represented Aaron and the entire Levitical priesthood, even though they had not even been born yet. But he, because he was their father, acknowledged the superiority of Melchizedek, and therefore that meant that the Levitical priesthood was not as great as the Melchizedekan priesthood. And Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And Jesus' new covenant is a greater covenant than the old covenant. Jesus' new covenant is the promise, or is the fulfillment of the promise made through Abraham, through Israel, that a new covenant would be made in the last days. Jesus is the more perfect sacrifice. None of those sacrifices under Torah could ever take away sin, even the blood of the red heifer. If the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling to the unclean, purifies to the sanctifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Jesus Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot. You see, the red heifer had to be without spot. But Jesus Christ was a sacrifice without spot and without blemish. He offered himself as a sacrifice unto God. His sacrifice sanctifies the conscience. It purifies our hearts. It truly takes away our sin. And thus, in every single way, the writer of Hebrews sets forth Jesus, not in anticipation of the restoration of the Levitical priesthood, not in any anticipation of a rebuilt Jerusalem, a rebuilt temple, a reinstituted animal sacrifices. No. He tells us Christ is the perfect one-time for all-time sacrifice. When he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Hebrews chapter 1, 2 and following. Christ is that perfect, eternal, effective sacrifice that does what the blood of no bull, no goat, no red heifer could ever do. Simply could not. And so the writer of Hebrews does not in any way, shape, form, or fashion anticipate a restored Jerusalem temple. You see, that ought to tell us something right there. As a matter of fact, when we read Hebrews, I want you to notice, I absolutely love this text in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. After talking about the superiority of Christ, his priesthood, his Melchizedekan priesthood, how Christ's Melchizedekan priesthood, you know, all of the Old Covenant Levitical priests of the Aaronic lineage, there were many of them by reason of death, all right? But this man has a priesthood that never ends, after the power of an endless life, the writer of Hebrews says. And those Old Covenant priests had to offer sacrifices first for themselves and for their own iniquities, then for the sins of the people. But not this man. This man was perfect. This man, in contrast to those Old Covenant priests, is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and now made higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, offer up sacrifices first for his own sins and then for the sins of the peoples. For this he did once when he offered up himself. The writer makes it a point of establishing Christ as serving over a greater priesthood, having offered a greater sacrifice, and that means he is serving in a greater temple. And thus the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1 says, now, the things of which we have been spoken of, here's the sum. Here's the summation of everything that we've talked about, of Jesus being greater than Moses, greater than Abraham, greater than the temple, greater than Aaron, greater than Levi, the perfect sacrifice. Here's the summation of everything that we're saying. We have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty of the heavens. Now, he's alluding directly to Psalms 110, verse 4. Set at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. This is the exaltation of Jesus. So anyway, notice what it says. We have such a high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary. Now watch this, catch the power of this, of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched and not man. Now here's something you really, really, really need to tie into, because it is incredible, it's wonderful, it's significant. Throughout the Bible, when the Bible refers to things made with hands, especially in the Old Testament, things made with hands regularly spoke of idols made with hands. Just go back and read Jeremiah chapter 44. And there you will find a description of the idols that were a man would take a tree stump and he would carve it with his knives and with his tools. And he would fashion it with his hands. And he would make a god out of it. And on the one hand, he would burn the chips from the stump those chips that he had cut out, and he would start a fire, and he would cook his food. And on the other hand, he would take that stump out of which he had formed an idol, and the form of a beast or a bird or whatever, and he would fall down and worship it. And of course, the Lord just scoffed at such hypocrisy. But the idea is that idol was made with hands. Many scholars have taken note of the fact that this terminology of made with hands does refer to idols. It's something man-made, and again, very often carries with it the connotation of something evil. Now, just because something is made with hands does not just automatically mean it's evil. But the connotation in many, if not most, of these texts where we are told of something that's made with hands, it does refer to idols. That which man had made, which he had turned into his object of worship, which he had turned into a substitute God, a surrogate God. Instead of worshiping the God who is the creator of heaven and earth, as Romans chapter 1 would express it, they began to worship and serve the creature more than they did the creator. And so when the writer of Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1 and 2, speaks of Jesus being a high priest over the true tabernacle, not made with hands, well, here's something incredible. Jesus in the New Testament even referred to the Jerusalem temple, or I should say contrasted the temple that he would make, the temple that he would build, and it would be a temple not made with hands. And that, folks, means, number one, it would not be an idolatrous thing. Number two, it would not be, quote, man-made. That is to say, it would not be a physical, literal edifice. But rather, it would be a spiritual reality. It's like this in Daniel chapter 2, 43 and 44, when we are told about the stone that was cut out of the mountain. It was a stone cut out without hands. Now, that's set in stark contrast to the previous four kingdoms: the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans that had been mentioned in that text of Daniel chapter 2. Those were man-made kingdoms. Those were earthly, physical, geopolitical, military kingdoms. But here, we're told about a kingdom that was coming that would be a stone cut out without hands. Now, how does that relate to the temple, the Messianic Temple? Well, when the Old Testament even predicted the coming of the Messianic Temple, and it's not going to be a temple made with hands. It's going to be a temple, and I'm getting ahead of myself a good little bit right here, okay? But this is so incredibly important. It is so incredibly exciting. The Old Testament predicted that the Messianic Temple was going to have a foundation stone of a living person, the Son of God. The stone that was rejected by the builders has become the chief cornerstone. And that chief cornerstone is none other than Jesus himself. And when you follow the Old Testament narrative, the timeline, if you please, of the rejected stone, the Messianic stone, you'll find very, very quickly that it is a reference to Jesus, the rejected stone, who became the chief cornerstone of the Messianic Temple. Well, now, folks, if Isaiah 8, if Isaiah 28:16 and following, if Psalms 118, if Daniel 2, if all of these texts spoke of the coming of a temple made without hands, of a temple whose chief cornerstone was a living person, then guess what? That means that any discussion of the last days literal physical edifice rebuilt in Jerusalem on the former site of the Herodian temple is absolutely 100% false. It's looking for something that was dead, as opposed to the living cornerstone. Why would anyone want and desire to even go to the literal physical edifice of a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem when Jesus is the chief cornerstone? He is the living stone in whom we live and we breathe and we find our very being. This is the temple of God, as the writer, the Apostle Paul, said in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. You are the temple of God, as it is written. And he quotes verbatim from Ezekiel chapter 36. Now, if Ezekiel 36 foretold the Messianic Temple, and if Paul quoted Ezekiel chapter 37, and said, you are that which was spoken, I'm sorry, folks, there is no alternative. We either accept that testimony and rejoice in the fact that Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone upon whom and in whom the Messianic Temple has been rebuilt, or we have to reject that stone all over again. And we have to take the position that although the New Testament is emphatic in stating that the temple of God is the church of the living God, built upon Jesus as the chief cornerstone, that there's still something better? There's still something else coming down the pike? What could be better? Why would we have anything other than this eternal Messianic? Once again, and we're going to be going over all of these passages, I'm sure, in the upcoming weeks and as we continue our discussion of the Messianic Temple. But we absolutely must see how the New Testament writers applied those Old Testament prophecies of the temple. It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains. Okay? Time frame, last days. Hebrews 1, in these last days, God has spoken to us through his Son. The time had come for the rebuilding of the temple. Now watch this. Once again, Isaiah chapter 2, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established. Well, Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. Well, these things I've written to you, hoping to come unto you shortly, but that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. Wait a minute. In the house of God, which is the church of the living God. Folks, can there be any doubt? Can there be any controversy? Can there be any dispute that the house of God, number one, is the temple. That's what it is in Isaiah. The house of God, everyone agrees, in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, is the temple, the Messianic Temple. And by the way, that's what it's called all down through history, house of God. And now here is Paul, who, by the way, had already written earlier and said, you are the temple of the living God. He had already written in Ephesians chapter 2, you therefore are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, being built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. You are being built up, a habitation of God, a dwelling of God through the Spirit. Well, what's the dwelling of God? It's the temple. You see, everywhere we go in the New Testament, the New Testament writers are using these Old Testament texts about the Messianic Temple, and they're using those texts, they're applying those texts to the church of the living God. Now, I do not know why we would ever want to ignore that testimony. But it's absolutely amazing to me how people can get so fixated upon a literal, physical building. And look, it's not a question of would a literal, physical temple be beautiful? That's not the issue. The question is a literal, physical temple actually, literally, in these prophetic passages of the Messianic Temple of the last days? And once again, when we see these New Testament passages applying these Old Testament prophecies of the Messianic stone, temple stone, and they apply those prophecies to Jesus personally, then you and I have absolutely no right whatsoever to turn those prophecies into a prediction of literal stones, literal building stones, into a prediction of a literal physical temple. So I urge our listeners to think carefully about the prophecies. Number one, about the time frame in the last days, realizing that the last days were in the first century. The last days are not the Christian age. The last days are not the last days of time. They are the last generation of Old Covenant Israel. Once we get that into our head, I want to tell you something. Once we get it into our head about properly identifying the last days, and by the way, as William pointed out on last week's program, okay, we know that the last days are about Israel because in Genesis chapter 49, as Jacob called his sons around him, and he said that he was going to tell them what will happen to them in the last days. Now think about that. Okay, if the last days are the Christian age, then we have a real conundrum here. Why? Well, because here's the reason why. In the amillennial world, we're told that the last days started on Pentecost. Oh, but wait. Pardon me. God was ostensibly through with Israel at the cross. Israel's last days, therefore, had to have existed prior to the cross, because the cross was supposedly the last day of Israel. Okay, well, what does that mean then? It means that since the cross was the last day of Israel's last days, of necessity, what that means is that the entirety of Genesis chapter 49 had to have been fulfilled prior to the cross of Jesus. Keep in mind, it shall come to pass in the last days, the mount of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains. So, unless Genesis 49 is talking about a different last days from that in Isaiah chapter 2, then that means that in the last days of Isaiah chapter 2, all of the things predicted in Genesis chapter 49 had to take place during that time frame, in the days prior to the cross, if the cross was the last day of Israel's time. But folks, it just doesn't work. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. Oh, wait a minute. That gathering is almost undoubtedly the eschatological gathering. It's the gathering of Matthew 24:31. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect from the four winds. But wait a minute. That Matthew 24:31 occurred at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That did not occur prior to the cross. So if Genesis 49:10 is equal to Matthew 24:31, then Matthew 24:31 is the fulfillment of Genesis 49:10. But wait a minute. That's Israel's last days. And that means that Israel's last days extended to AD 70 and the coming of the Son of Man and the gathering together of the elect. You see, it's simply illogical, it's unbiblical to suggest that Israel's last days ended at the cross. I mean, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. Now, mind you, folks, I once believed that the cross was Israel's last day. I believe that the last days started on the day of Pentecost. But once again, here's the problem. Here's the real issue. All right? All millennialists tell us that God was through with Israel at the cross. But they tell us the last days began on Pentecost. Oh, wait a minute. Genesis chapter 49 is about what would happen to Israel, the bloodline descendants of Israel in the last days. Do you see the problem? The problem is one of chronology. You cannot say that that Israel's last day was the cross without demanding that Genesis 49 was fulfilled prior to the cross. But, as we've already shown, Genesis 49 was not fulfilled at the cross. The gathering took place in AD 70. Oh, but wait. Genesis 49 would be fulfilled in the last days. The last days existed after the cross, after Pentecost. And so if you're an amillennialist and you say that God was through with Israel at the cross, then how are you going to deal with Genesis 49? Because Genesis 49 is about what would happen to Israel in the last days. Well, that means that those prophecies of what would happen to Israel in the last days had to be fulfilled after Pentecost, after the time that God was supposedly through with Israel. Well, how could God be through with Israel at the cross if he didn't even fulfill his promises of Genesis chapter 49 until after the cross? Give a little anecdote here. Some years ago, I spoke at a conference in a place called Red Boiling Springs, Tennessee. I was literally the only preterist there. Well, actually, there was one other closet preterist there. But all of that aside, there was a brother that stopped me in the hallway after services that evening. Very, very nice guy. And he said, "Listen, Brother Preston, I just don't get where you're coming from. He said, how in the world can you say that God was not through with Israel at the cross? He said, that is such a fundamental doctrine. And he said, I just don't understand how you can say that the law did not end until AD 70. I said, well, okay, let me ask you a question. I said, you have your Bible with you. Please turn to Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, where Paul says, and now blindness has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And thus all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, the Redeemer shall come out of Zion. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sin. I said, now, this passage is talking about the coming of the Lord. It's not his incarnation. It's the coming of the Lord. And I pointed out that it would be in fulfillment of Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59. Well, the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 27 and the coming of the Lord in Isaiah 29 is the coming of the Lord in judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood. That didn't happen at the cross, didn't happen at Pentecost. Jesus said that the avenging of all of the blood of all of the righteous, all the way back to creation, would take place in the judgment of Jerusalem in AD 70. So I pointed out to this fella, I said, in Romans chapter 11, Paul is anticipating the coming of the Lord and judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood. That would also be the time of the salvation of Israel. And it says, this is my covenant with them. I said, therefore, Christ's coming and judgment of Israel would be in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel in AD 70. I said, let me ask you a question. How could it be in fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel in AD 70 if God's covenant with Israel had already been annulled, taken out of the way at the cross? He stood there totally silent, and he just stared at me. Finally, he said, Brother Preston, I have no idea in the world how to answer that question. He said, in the first place, I don't understand Romans 11. But he said, I will go home and I will study. Listen, folks, thanks so very, very much for joining us this evening on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. We truly appreciate you being with us every week. It's a great privilege to be here, a great privilege to be able to share our thoughts with you. We hope and we trust that we do, in fact, provide solid biblical answers to the questions that you have about the end times. And by the way, on this subject of, the Messianic Temple, send us your questions, all right? Go to William Bell's site, allthingsfulfilled.com. Send him an email with the questions that you might have about the Messianic Temple. Go to my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. Send me an email with questions that you may have about the Messianic Temple, about the red-heifer, about the last days. We want to provide the answers. And look, if we don't have the answers, we'll just go to study it. We'll try to find the answers for you. We're not afraid to say that we don't know. But in the meantime, thanks again for joining us here on Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Don Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust.